Good morning, everyone. And I would also like to acknowledge the Aboriginal nations as the first peoples of Australia and thank them for their custodianship of the land and pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participants who might be in the audience today. I'd like to thank the Adoption Institute for inviting me to offer this presentation. As Amy pointed out, the focus will be on reunification or restoration. The terms seem to be used interchangeably. And reunification is considered to be at the heart of meaningful practice. We have some international commentators who've made important statements about reunification. There's, for instance, Jill Barrick from Berkeley University, who's written a book called Take Me Home. And she has argued that every child deserves a safe and caring environment which provides them with enhanced opportunities. And every parent should be actively supported and have reasonable opportunities to bring their child back home. There's also Rick Barth from University of Maryland in the US, whose work is across the whole child welfare continuum. And Rick points out that parents should have reasonable services to allow them to resume care of their children, and that children also deserve the chance to go back to homes which are safe and homes to which they want to return to. So I guess reunification, as has been pointed out, is one of the options, and in fact the first option in the permanency continuum. And yet it is a very invisible area of work, a invisible work area of practice generally. And it doesn't receive, I guess, the priority that it needs in terms of being able to support practitioners in this work. So it is really gratifying to know that New South Wales is investing a substantial amount of money into promoting and supporting reunification services, and also to see that today's forum has included reunification on the agenda. There's, I guess, a great deal of research that has been undertaken, both nationally and internationally, for at least 2 decades. The methodologies used in different countries have been different, but for the most part, some of the findings have converged. And I'm going to highlight some of these findings. Broadly, the research has focused on decision-making purposes, trying to identify some of the predictor variables that point to the possibility of reunification. We have both cross-sectional and we have longitudinal studies as well. There are differences in the methodologies adopted in different countries. In Australia and in the US, we do see some large-scale studies and the use of I guess, quasi-experimental designs. We see the UK research tending to focus on smaller samples in greater depth, interviewing carers, birth parents, and children. Before, in this presentation, I was going to highlight some key findings across both different countries, including Australia, and then focus on one particular reunification study in Australia. So first of all, for a definition, we have a definition that says it's the return of children in foster care to the home of their birth family. But we have a broader definition from Tony Maluccio, who says it's a process aimed at helping children in out-of-home care to attain the optimum level of reconnection with their birth family. And that optimum level of reconnection may fall somewhere on the continuum from physical return through to lesser forms of contact and visitation. It is a primary goal of foster care systems and, according to the data, the most common permanency planning decision. Sometimes by plan and design, and sometimes by default. Okay. So in terms of studies that have been conducted in this area, we see two kinds of studies. One that looks at outlining the timing or the speed of reunification and measuring some of the predictors of reunification. And a second group of studies that look at re-entry, where child has been restored but re-enters care, looking again at timing and predictors. We have limited research from Australia, but it's certainly growing. Now, just for some highlights, we first of all see the focus on when reunification is likely to occur, basically focusing on timing. And what we see here is that it's more likely to occur earlier in the trajectory of the placement and decreases the longer the time the child spends in care. So just to highlight a few major studies that highlight this finding, Dickens in the UK, for instance, found that 44% of all children in care returned home within 2 years, and of this cohort, 40% returned within 8 to 12 weeks. And Wulshan from the United States noted that 28% of children are reunified in the first year of being in care, and the probability of reunification drops subsequently. Another factor that has been looked at is also the the types of placements and the pattern of placements. Stability of placements is associated with good reunification outcomes, and some studies have shown that where the child has experienced a number of placements, the speed of reunification and also the success of reunification tends to diminish. In terms of type of placement also, children are less likely or return to their parents at a slower rate when they are in kinship placements compared to children who are in non-kinship placements. And for instance, from Pharma in the UK, children who are placed in voluntarily or non-court-ordered placements are significantly more likely to return. Other studies have looked at demographic characteristics relating to children as well as to families. And here we see that, for example, in terms of age, children who are younger tend to take longer to return than children who are older. In terms of ethnic background, in the United States, African American children reunify at a slower rate, and in Australia as well, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander are found to be significantly less likely to reunify, and if they do, they reunify at a much slower rate than others. Some studies have shown that children who are placed with siblings have higher prospects of reunification, but that's a mixed finding. Other studies have contradicted that finding. The other aspect that has been looked at is family disadvantage as being a robust predictor of slower rates of reunification. So for example, Jones has noted that poor accommodation, one of the most damaging aspects of poverty and deprivation, residents in public housing, marginal housing, tend to predict lower rates of reunification. And we've seen that also in some of the Australian studies. Reasons for care. There is a large body of research that's focused on the association between reasons for entry to care and prospects of reunification. And here we see that parents who have physical health problems are more likely to have their children restored than those parents who have mental health problems or problems with drug and alcohol abuse, or also domestic violence. And children who enter care for reasons of neglect do poorly in terms of reunification. They have very slow rates of reunification compared to children who enter care for other reasons, such as physical or sexual abuse. Okay, I want to move on. Parental visitation and contact has been a major predictor of reunification. Many studies have found a strong association between consistent and regular contact and early reunification. Some studies have tried to identify some of the facilitators and barriers to reunification, and particularly in the United States, you have a number of specialist family reunification services that have found, that have tended to, I guess, be associated with earlier returns compared to service as usual type of programs. And here, parent-worker partnerships have been a key factor in supporting those early returns. And facilitators of reunification are largely, I guess, particular interventions focused on parents who have particular circumstances and particular difficulties in terms of parenting and parenting capacity. But also these studies have shown that families who receive a large number of practical services like daycare, home necessities, housing support, achieve timely returns. In terms of barriers, agency commitment to reunification goals tends to be predictive of positive reunification trends. But lack of attention and commitment and leadership from the agency is identified as a factor in slower reunification. I won't go through the reentry data, which again identifies similar factors, but I'd like to move on to the profiles of successful and unsuccessful reunifications before I discuss one of my studies. And there are factors that are child-related, such as age, ethnic background, and the attempt to reunify multiple children at the same time, as well as children's behavioral problems. And from the family's point of view, family-related circumstances, poverty and environmental stresses, and the lack of social support. Similarly, single-parent status has been found to militate against speedy reunification, as also parental substance abuse and domestic violence. Okay. I will now focus on a couple of Australian studies, but only one of them in detail. First of all, Paul Del Fabro and I have been involved in a cross-institutional national study of reunification, which was a multi-jurisdictional study of reunification, looking at patterns and predictors, using a common template for data extraction. This was, of course, based on administrative data, and it used a retrospective longitudinal sampling strategy. So the placement trajectories were tracked for between 2 to 3 years, depending on when children entered care, but trajectories were tracked until December 2010. This is an overview of the sample from each of the states, Tasmania, Victoria, South Australia, New South Wales, and Queensland. And as you will see, we have varying patterns of reunification in each of those states. I haven't got time to go into the details of the data from each of the states, but just to give you a highlight, for instance, in one particular state, 468 children were restored once without re-entry, while 72 of them had multiple re-entries to care. And the odds of reunification were lower for children of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent. The other factor that came out clearly was also that children who were in kinship care had lower odds of reunification compared to those who were in non-relative placements. The second study that I want to look at is research collaboration involving the University of New South Wales and Barbados, Australia, which was supported by an ARC linkage grant. And this study was conducted using prospective longitudinal design and mixed methods, quantitative and qualitative. The sample included 168 children from 96 families, and this sample was drawn from 5 of the temporary family care programs of Barbados, a particular program that is focused on, promoting or at least supporting families towards reunification, and where that is not possible, children go into the Find a Family long-term permanent care program. So all the data was collected through face-to-face interviews with caseworkers and a subsample of birth parents and foster carers. In terms of the actual profile of participants in the study, we had, 50% of the children under 5, and in terms of the mothers, 83% were over the age of 25. In terms of employment and income, 87% of the families were receiving benefits as their primary source of income. And in terms of housing, 70% were living in public housing, about 5% were homeless at the time. Now, there's been some emphasis on using ecologically oriented assessment tools in order to estimate or to assess parents at the time of entry to care and for the purposes of reunification. And essentially, the purpose is to estimate the level of parental change in parental capacity or in child, as well as in child functioning in the context of making decisions. And I drew on a particular standardized measure that was developed in North Carolina by Ray Kirk. And this, from a review of reunification internationally by June Thorburn, this is the only study that actually uses a standardized scale for assessment. So this scale is referred to, abbreviated to NICFAS. Originally, it was designed for the purpose of families who were in family preservation, intensive family preservation or family support programs, and was therefore thereafter adapted for reunification. And it includes 7 domains: the environment, parental capabilities, family interactions, child well-being, family safety, caregiver and child ambivalence, and readiness for reunification. So this is actually, an overview of the whole assessment framework. So as you'll see, it is, this was completed by caseworkers at the time of intake, time 1. This study involved 2 waves of data collection, which are referred to as time 1 and time 2. And this assessment was completed at time 1, which would be about 4 to 6 weeks within the child's entry to care, to the temporary program. And then it was completed again subsequently at the time of reunification or at the time of case closure. The study sample was followed up for 18 months. Workers were asked to complete these ratings. As you will see, each domain has a number of subscales, and each domain is rated on a 6-point scale. And that includes 3 strength ratings and 3 problem ratings. So within each domain, they are required to rate either the strength or the problem ratings, depending on what was applicable. In addition, there is a global item right at the end, which requires the caseworker to make a global assessment on that particular domain. So I have a copy of this, which I can distribute at the end of this presentation. Now, the child well-being, just to give you a sense of the type of ratings and how they, I guess, are portrayed in the study. The child well-being domain, for instance, includes mental health, school performance, child behavior, relationship with parents, with siblings, with peers, and their motivation to maintain the family. And as you can see, some of the highest ratings relate to children's behavioral problems. Another illustration is the family safety domain. And here you see, again, the presence of emotional abuse rated as a moderate to serious problem, and also the presence of neglect rated as a moderate to serious problem. And the environmental domain, which includes about 7 different subscales. And here, of course, safety in the community, habitability of housing, and also food and nutrition feature among the moderate and serious problems in terms of having high ratings. The ratings from time 1 to time 2, that is at intake and closure, are presented here. And what I've focused on is the mild, moderate, and serious problem ratings in this diagram here. So it's a comparison here of the worker ratings on the serious problem, moderate to serious problem dimension. And to summarize, what we see here is that the trend is that if you look at overall parental capabilities, there is some improvement. At time 1, about 70 cases fell within the moderate to serious problem index. And this showed considerable decrease at time 2, dropping to 31%. But still, 39% of the families were still experiencing serious problems in that domain at time 2. Similarly, if you look at child well-being, you see some shift, some change in terms of the problems experienced from 60% dropping down to 20% in this case. And this probably was related to some of the work that was being done with the parent-child relationship. Okay. The data was analyzed in 2 ways. The first analysis was basically focused on the pattern of reunification, the timing of reunification, and some of the factors associated with it. The second one focused on the NICFAS ratings of risk and protective factors. So in the first analysis, using event history analysis, also referred to as survival analysis, we estimate the probability of children remaining in care or going home at any point in time. And then subsequently, we also use a proportional hazard model to predict the likelihood of particular factors such as age or reasons for placement being associated with the speed of return. So from this, as you can see, the majority of returns that did take place occurred early in the placement, and usually in the first 5 to 6 months. After that, we see a plateauing and the decline in terms of reunifications. The first curve refers to any restoration, the second one, restoration to a parent, and the third one to restoration to kin. So in terms of age, looking at some of the factors associated, compared to the rate for infants, the rate for 5-year-olds and older children is about 2.3 times greater. And in terms of reasons, compared to children who entered care for reasons of parents' physical health or disability, those who entered for reasons of parental substance abuse or mental health had an 86% lower rate of return. Where abuse and neglect was a reason, there was an 83% lower rate of return, and where there was domestic violence involved, there was a 73% lower rate of return. So drawing on the second analysis, we used the typology of the NICFAS, the different domains, in order to, group the families in terms of the particular problems that they presented. We use what is called latent profile analysis, which is a method that tends to group families according to the similarity of their profiles. And in this case, we identified families according to high risk, medium risk, and low risk. And the uniqueness of this method is that it's not the caseworker or the researcher that is making a decision about where the families fall into these three clusters, but it is driven by the data itself. And so we identified 3 risk groups, the low risk group 14%, the medium risk group 48%, and the high risk group 37.5%. And just to comment on the high-risk group, these are parents who had moderate to serious problems in 3 domains: the parental capabilities, the family safety, and the family interactions. So children in the high-risk group had a 73% lower speed of reunification. And in terms of age, children who were older, as I said before, had a faster rate of reunification compared to the children who were younger. Moving on now to the qualitative data. And here we see that 97% of the workers considered contact to be extremely important to the reunification process, and they had particular reasons as they considered particular groupings of children. For young children, they felt it was important to maintain the attachment so that when children returned, it was not distressing. For older children, it was about giving them reassurance that the parents still care for them. And for parents, it was about enhancing the relationship. And they were using contact particularly as an important context to make judgments about the feasibility of reunification, because it gave them an opportunity to observe the parent-child relationship in that context. Carers had particular views also about contact, mostly supportive. They perceived it had a vital role to play in maintaining links between the parent and the child. I think it's very important. You need to make sure that they know mom hasn't abandoned them, that it's important to keep whatever they have with mom as an important part of their life. So we get them to draw pictures, cards, write letters to mom, take photos, and send them back to mom, so mom and dad know what's happening while they're here. But of course, for parents, they valued the contact. They felt that it alleviated the issue of issues of loss, the distress of separation, and so on. But one of the important things that came from parents was that they felt that the contact exposed them to the carer's parenting approach, gave them models of parenting that they were not aware of or had very little exposure to. But they also identified barriers such as cost, travel, location. They didn't like the intrusiveness of supervised contact. We would have some person following us with a goddamn clipboard writing everything down. It was embarrassing for my children. They really resented that. The other issue that came out from the carer data, the qualitative data, was their insights about making assessments for reunification and of parenting capacity. And some of the things that they were looking for was parental empathy, their awareness of the child's needs, their ability to look at issues from the child's perspective, their willingness to undertake some of the requirements set by the courts or set by Barnardo's or set by the statutory department, and also engaging with services in order to, I guess, effect some of those changes. But they also pointed out that one of the issues was the availability of services, that there were long waiting lists, and that was challenging and perhaps difficult for both parents and for them. They also looked for parents' level of cooperation. They felt that if parents were cooperative or demonstrated a potential to be cooperative, it was a kind of insurance against having a workable relationship with parents before and after reunification. They also placed a lot of value on knowing when parents asked for help, because here again they felt that was an indication that after reunification parents would reach out for help if they needed it. Carers' views on reunification. Carers had a lot to say about importance of reunification, challenges of reunification, and so on. They believed that it was the best possible outcome. Many of them did, and possibly because this is a program where carers are recruited and trained with a clear understanding that it is temporary care. I think whenever reunification is possible, it's the best thing. Kids should go back to their parents, but the parents have to prove that they are capable of looking after the kids. This last quote, it ended up that it was Megan, the birth parent, and I arranging times and everything. That's what we did. We did it our way. We worked it out between us. In terms of, I think I'll move on. Parents had some concerns about, I guess, system-related issues. Particularly, they found the court process daunting and didn't always feel supported. But in fact, they valued the support of caseworkers. That, for example, one parent says, she was upfront, she told me before that whatever I say and do, she has an obligation to tell the statutory department. So I knew, but she was upfront about it in the first place, and therefore I fully trust her. Also, they valued the presence of the caseworkers at court hearings and in the lead up to court hearings. You don't feel stuck. You don't feel like you're on your own. Some of this is about parent-carer relationships and how important they were in terms of being able to achieve reunification. Some of the challenges for the parents were fear of being unsuccessful and kids being removed again, worry about children's challenging behaviors, concerns about children fitting into school and getting over the trauma, because in some cases children change schools, and also fear and trepidation about the future. Implications, couple? Okay. So the implications, I guess, in terms of what we've seen in the data, agency's leadership and demonstrated commitment to reunification, which was very obvious in this particular program. Also, the findings showed a pattern where children reunify in the early months after entry to care. And this has implications for practitioners in terms of ensuring that resources, caseloads are prioritized to maximum the potential for reunification support. So in other words, more proactive work in relation to reunification. But this is not to suggest people should rush out and reunify without making appropriate assessments. But it is basically saying the potential for reunification is greater in those earlier weeks, in earlier months. Also, I guess, collaboration with the court systems as well as the other players, such as caseworkers from the department. There's also, I guess, system-related implications, which is to do with interagency collaboration in order to address some of the structural dimensions of the kind of circumstances that confront parents, such as financial needs, housing, and also counseling support in the context of other psychosocial problems. Leadership from supervisors. I've also suggested, I guess, support from schools. While I was in the UK, I was impressed by the virtual schools system that supported children who were looked after in terms of education, but that support was also extended to children in need, and those included children who might have been reunified, because carers receive a great deal of support and resources while children are in their care, and it would seem to me that parents are entitled to some of those supports, at least in the early hours early times post-reunification. In terms of child-related implications, I think very careful assessment that includes the voices of children in making those assessments, also monitoring children's reactions to, I guess, before and after reunification, and continuation of the educational support, therapy, and other kinds of interventions that they were receiving during the time that they were in care. I'll stop there. Okay, and here's a list of publications, both from the national study, which Paul and I collaborated on, and also this particular study that I've talked about. Thank you.